Hi everybody, it's Laura from Green Tree, and today we're talking about baking substitutions. This is a time of year where a lot of people do their baking, and sometimes it can be kind of tricky if someone that you know or even you yourself have allergies or other dietary restrictions that stop you from going for those classic recipes that you know and love. So we're going to kind of give you some ways to adapt those things so that everybody can eat and enjoy them. I'm going to kind of break this into sections, and we're going to start with flours. Probably the most common substitution that people want to do with flours is to make something gluten-free. Gluten-free baking can be really easy or really tricky depending on how you go about it. If you want to make your own flour blend using something like, say, tapioca flour or garbanzo flour, almond flour, coconut flour, any of these natural flours, that's great to do, but you have to be careful because they don't have any built-in binders. Now, gluten is a natural binder that happens when you work wheat flour, and there are two compounds in it called gliadin and glutenin that come together to form gluten. And that's what makes the bread be able to kind of stretch as you knead it and work with it, and it creates these little sort of air pockets that can form inside your baked goods. The amount of air in a baked good is really important. So again, if you're using something like tapioca, you're going to have to add some sort of external binder to it. Some of the most common are xanthan gum and arrowroot powder, though there's other ways of going about it. You can also go this way. Sorry, this is a little heavier. This is the Bob's Red Mill 1-to-1 baking flour blend. This is great because it already has the binder mixed into it, and you can just put this in any recipe that you have, use it exactly the same way that you would if you were using regular wheat flour, and you're going to notice very little difference in the finished product. Sorry, I keep scrunching up my nose today. My glasses are falling down. But anyway, this is a good one because this does not contain a bunch of bean flours. You want to be careful if you're making your own gluten-free baking mixes that if you're making sweet dishes, you want to use things like nut flours and rice flours, or even tapioca that I showed you earlier, rather than bean flours, because they can give an odd sort of savory flavor to your baked goods. That's fine if you're making something like biscuits, not so great if you're making a chocolate cupcake. Sorry, let me tuck this over here. Okay. Oh, and our deli manager wanted me to make sure to tell you that when you're doing gluten-free baking, you may want to adjust the amount of fat in the recipe because gluten-free flours don't absorb as much fat as regular glutinous flours do. So you might want to cut down a little bit on the butter or the oil because otherwise there's a risk of it sort of melting out of the food as it bakes. So that's flours. We're going to go on to eggs next. How to replace eggs. You may want to do that because you're allergic to eggs, because you want your dish to be vegan, or just because you're trying to cut down on the cholesterol that's in the dish. There's a lot of different ways to replace eggs. This one, the Energy Egg Replacer, is really good. I know, everything's reversed. This one's really good because you can use this whether the egg in the recipe is a leavening agent, something that's binding the recipe together, or something that's adding moisture. It's really important when you're replacing eggs to know what purpose the eggs in the recipe are serving. This one, it doesn't matter. You can know that you're safe to use it and it'll stand in for eggs in all three of those situations. An easy rule of thumb is if a recipe only calls for one egg, it's probably a binder or a moisturizing agent. In that case, you can also pretty easily make your own replacement with something like chia seeds. I know you've seen these before if you've been watching the videos, but these are something that you can easily grind a little bit and mix with water to create a sticky egg replacer. That works great as a binder. You can do the same thing with flax seeds. But they're not so great if you want to use your eggs as a leavening agent. If you want to use them as a leavening agent, that's something that gives lift to your finished project. So if you want a cupcake that's like this, go ahead and use chia seeds in place of eggs. But if you want a cupcake that's like this, then you want to use something with acid. Pretty common replacers are buttermilk, which you can make by taking any kind of milk, about a cup, and mixing in around a tablespoon or so of an acid. Like, I prefer lemon juice, but you can also use vinegar. And letting that curdle, and then that will replace the acid reaction that happens with the eggs in your baked goods. You could also use yogurt or non-dairy yogurt if you want it to be a leavener. Now, one really cool thing that you can use, so this is a can of garbanzo beans. I don't know if you've used these, but when you pour the liquid out of a can of beans like this, that cooking liquid is called Aqua Fava. You should Google it. It's really neat the stuff you can do with it. But you can take that and you can whip it the same way that you can whip egg whites, and it'll fluff up and create something that's almost like the texture that you would get when you were whipping egg whites to make a meringue. And you can use that as a leavening agent, as a replacer for eggs. It also works well as a moisturizer or a binder, so it's pretty similar to this egg replacer in that you can use it in most recipes. And you can actually use the cooking liquid from any beans. It just so happens that the cooking liquid from garbanzo beans happens to be more effective in a lot of ways, and it has a nice mild flavor, so you don't need to worry about your muffins coming out tasting like kidney beans. So those are some of the best egg replacers. Again, just make sure with any recipe you want to make sure, are you leavening the recipe, moisturizing the recipe, or binding the recipe. Oh, and if it's just for moisture, you can go ahead and use something like applesauce or pumpkin puree. That'll add some nice flavor and work really well. In that scenario, you could also probably use mashed bananas. So let's see. I think that's all the ones I wanted to tell you about eggs. Next, we're going to talk about sweeteners. So you're used to a recipe calling for a cup or 2 cups, or in some extreme cases, even 3 cups of sugar when you're making these holiday baked goods. And you might want to cut down on that or replace it for one reason or another. One common thing people like to use is honey or maple syrup. You can use those as a pretty much a 1-to-1 replacer for granulated sugar. But as you can see, honey flows. Same thing with syrup, same thing with molasses, because there's a higher liquid component. So if you're using honey or molasses or syrup, or agave syrup even, as a replacer for granulated sugar, you should cut down on the liquid in the recipe. For about 1/3 to 1/4 of a cup less liquid for every cup of the liquid sweetener. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a dough that's a little bit too soft, or a batter that's too soft, and it won't start to cook fast enough, and you won't get as good of a rise on it. You can also, there we go, use things like stevia. Here we go. But I really hesitate to give you a specific guide to how much to use with things like stevia or xylitol, because they vary so much from brand to brand. If you're going to use something like this, which is basically a 0-calorie sweetener, you want to check the package directions for that individual product. Most of these companies have great instructions on their websites, so I really suggest checking that before you substitute it in a recipe. And the important thing is, whether you're using stevia or honey or any other sugar replacer, or just cutting down on your granulated sugar, is it's going to reduce the browning in the recipe. So you just want to watch it closer when you're cooking it. You're not going to get that same kind of color over the top of what you're baking that's going to show you that it's done. So you're going to have to be a little bit more careful about maybe checking it with a knife or whatever you're using to test the middle and see if it's cooked through. It's not going to be quite as pretty necessarily when you're done, but if you're frosting it or decorating it, it doesn't really matter, and it is going to have a lot less sugar in it. There we go. You can, let's see. Yep, so you can use any of those in pretty much whatever you want to do, but our deli manager also wanted me to tell you, this was his suggestion, that if you're using one of these sugar replacers, you should also cut your cooking temperature down by about 25 degrees because of that difference to the way that it browns and the way that the sugar acts as kind of a liquid when you're baking things. But the temperature has to be higher to get it really melted and incorporated into that. With these other liquid sweeteners and replacers, you don't need that temperature quite so high. It'll also reduce the risk of you accidentally overcooking it when you're watching for that browning that isn't going to happen to the same degree. So that's sweeteners. And then fats. Oh, everybody loves fats in baked goods. You got to have something in there, right? And a lot of these classic recipes call for butter. But we don't always want to use butter, either because you need it to be a milk-free recipe because somebody's got an allergy, you want it to be vegan, or you, again, just want to cut down on the cholesterol. So one of my favorite butter replacers, just 1-to-1, is coconut oil. you can just go ahead and scoop it in there. It's still a saturated fat. It's not an animal product. It still browns well. It's still got that stiffness at room temperature. You can still cream it with sugar the same way that you can with butter. So this will pretty much work in anything. The other way I'd suggest going would be to just go ahead and use a butter replacer. There's quite a few companies that make them. Earth Balance is a pretty popular one. And you can just go ahead and put that in 1 for 1. But sometimes you're not using a stiff fat like coconut oil or butter. You're using an oil. And oil can be a little bit trickier to replace than butter. You don't just want to cut it down because that's something else that will affect the browning rates of the baked goods. And it also is going to affect the richness of the finished product if you just remove it entirely. You can usually go in with your liquid oils and replace about half of it with something like applesauce or pumpkin puree, but only about half. If you take it out entirely, it's really going to affect the finished dish, especially if it's something like cookies that's meant to have some crispness to it. It'll be kind of softer and gummier if you replace it 100% in a dish that's supposed to have some snap to it at the end. It would be a lot easier to do in a muffin or a cake, something like that. You could just go ahead and throw in your applesauce or even bananas and you'll be fine. You can actually replace bananas 100% for the oil in baked goods like muffins, cakes, and quick breads as well. So that's my main touch-ins on fats. And then the last one that I'm going to go ahead and, you can use nut butters as well. Nut butters is the other thing you can use as a replacement. I don't think I actually have an example, so I'll just imagine I have nut butters. But you can use those as a replacer for fats in a lot of different recipes, but you have to know that it will add some flavor to the finished dish. And then you just want to experiment a little bit with, I would probably start with going half of the fat replaced with nut butters, see how you like it, a little bit more. Depending on the recipe, it's going to vary. And also depending on the nut butter. Cashew is much creamier and fattier. You're probably going to have an easier time replacing with that than you would something heavier like almond butter. So you just want to try a few different things if you're going to use nut butter as a fat replacer. And then finally, my last tip is if you're looking to avoid corn, and I can tell you 100% that this works because I've done it myself, you can replace baking powder with a mix of cream of tartar and baking soda. That works because this is another thing that's a leavening agent. You want to have this acid-base reaction in order to create all those delightful bubbles inside your baked goods. So for every teaspoon of baking powder, you can use a half teaspoon of cream of tartar and a quarter teaspoon of baking soda. And then you can avoid the cornstarch if you have someone who's sensitive to corn in their diet. Finally, if you want to get really into this, there's a lot of cookbooks out there about substitutions. I brought 2 from home to show you really quick, but these are really handy guides. So I like this one a lot. I know, it's backwards, so I'm just going to tell you the title of this is The Complete Guide to Vegan Food Substitutions. Now, I don't eat all vegan foods myself, although I do quite a few of them. Something like this is really useful because at the beginning of every section, it's got these lovely little charts that'll tell you if you're using this item, replace it with this. And there's a lot of great substitution books that have that kind of thing in it. And then they'll give you some recipes to work with so that you can try those substitutions out before you start throwing them into your tried and true recipes. Then if you really, really want to get into it, I suggest Cooking for Geeks. This is an amazing cookbook. It gets into the science behind all of these reactions, the reasons why, for example, you can use yogurt to replace eggs if it's supposed to be a leavener but not flax seeds. It explains all of those little nitty-gritty reactions. It gets down to the reaction that occurs on the surface of a steak as you brown it, to why making scones works with this twist on the recipe and not with that one. Just lots of really fun little details about food. I mean, there's a chapter called Playing with Chemicals, which is a good sign in a cookbook, I think. This is actually really about natural cooking interactions for the most part, but it can also really help you understand why one substitution will work and the other won't. So those are my suggestions for cooking substitutions. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments. Either my deli manager or myself will go through and try and answer those for you if you have any other substitution questions or tips that you'd like to share with everybody. So I hope you have a great time experimenting with your holiday baking. Maybe check out some of these books, and have a happy Tuesday. Bye guys.